Good afternoon. Today we have a single subject briefing for you. Our guest is Commodore Andrew Gough of the Royal Navy, who will brief you on the NATO's Standing Naval Force Atlantic, or STANNAVFORLANT in Pentagonese. Sir?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you just heard, my name is Commodore Andrew Gough, and I'm a member of the Royal Navy. But this badge removes my national status from me, and I'm now a NATO officer speaking to you right now. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'd just like to outline to you what we are in STANNAVFORLANT, who we are, what we exist for, and what we've been doing for the last few months. For almost 30 years now, the Standing Naval Force Atlantic has been at the forefront of the Atlantic Alliance demonstration of strength and unity at sea, and I accent the word there, at sea. The force was approved by the NATO's Defence Planning Committee in 1967 and was stood up in 1968 and has been in continuous commission, as we would say in navalese, ever since. It is one of only 3 standing forces available to NATO. The other 2, Standing Naval Force Mediterranean, Standing Naval Force Channel, are under the command of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Jules, whose headquarters, as I'm sure you know, is at Mons in Belgium. And my force is under the command of SACLANT down at Norfolk, and is the only permanent peacetime force that SACLANT has under his command in his NATO hat. He is, of course, General Sheehan, US Marine Corps, and is also US ACOM, as I'm sure you're really well aware. The Allied Atlantic Command extends from the North Pole to the Tropic of Cancer, from the littoral of the USA and North America to the littoral of Europe, includes Portugal, which gives SACLANT a small toehold in the mainland of Europe. STANNAVFORLANT itself is composed normally of 5 to 8 frigates or destroyers, taken one from each of the primary nations of the Alliance Atlantic Command. Canada, the Netherlands, the Federal Republic of Germany, the United Kingdom and the US all provide ships permanently on about 6-month rotations. The smaller nations, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, assign ships on an occasional basis, several shorter durations, 2 to 3 months typically. In addition, Denmark provides a submarine to the force for about 6 weeks of the year. Spain, which has a very special relationship to NATO and whose forces are not integrated in the alliance, as you're probably aware, provides a ship on an occasional basis. And in my time in command so far, we've not yet had a Spanish ship in the force. The ships you see listed here are the current ships, with the exception of the Olfert Fisher, who joins the force tomorrow in Norfolk. She's presently en route from Bermuda. The seagoing commander, that's me, is assigned in rotation for 1 year from April to April, and I will be relieved next year by a Dutch officer, who in turn will be relieved by a German, and in turn, etc., through the principal 5 permanent members of the force. The seagoing element of it is a very good example of burden sharing, the way in which all nations represent themselves within the Atlantic seagoing area. Our aims, we have a number of aims, the first of which is to demonstrate unity and commonality of purpose by showing the flag, which is a traditional naval mission, particularly in peacetime. Secondly, to improve effectiveness of multinational naval teamwork through constant practice, constant exercising, and our mutual shared experiences. Thirdly, to be capable of acting as an immediate reaction force. That means that we have to be ready at 48 hours' notice to go wherever the North Atlantic Council might decide to send us. The last 2 elements of our missions are achieved by constant practice in NATO exercises in order to maintain that immediate reaction status, and also in order to practice interoperability issues. You might like to explore those issues later in questions, because you can appreciate when you have different nations operating different equipment but in the same force, how do we ensure that all our equipment is interoperable? It's something we've been working on for 45 years. In addition, the force provides what we believe is a visible demonstration of the transatlantic link. And speaking as a European to a largely American audience, I can tell you that we view that as a very crucial item indeed. And finally, our fourth aim is to form the nucleus around which a larger and more capable naval force could be built, should that be required. You'll be aware of NATO's new concept of combined joint task forces, which will employ the full spectrum of joint capabilities in both in and outer area operations. And SNIFL could form the basis of a typical maritime-based combined joint task force around which we could be built into a larger force to be sent to a particular crisis by whatever timescale is required of us. We do have the proven communications, the common language, effective and reliable weapon systems, and above all else, a clear chain of command. The force is a bold example of international fellowship at sea and of the nations of the Atlantic Alliance, particularly the Atlantic nations. The ship's crews themselves perfect the technique of operating together by constant practice between ships, and we do exchange members of the ship's companies. In my time in command since April, we have exchanged between ourselves almost the equivalent of a full ship's company of people for 2 to 3 days at a time, operating in different ships, operating the equipment, living with the other ship's company, getting to know each other and understanding the way we operate. And it is one of the high points of the way in which we get to know each other. The way in which we get to know each other and operate interoperably and practice our interoperability in more practical terms is by using each other's equipment and designing our equipment so that it is, from the build upwards, built to operate with each other's equipment. This level of cooperation and understanding has proved to be vital in underpinning a number of Allied ventures. You will have remembered Desert Storm. You'll recall that a large number of warships from many nations were sent to that operation. It wasn't, of course, a NATO operation, but the ships that were in the Gulf were actually operating and used to operating together through their time in NATO. And that ability to operate, even not under a NATO command and not under a NATO operation, was inherent in the experience that we had learned here in the Atlantic by operating together over the last 40-odd years. More recently, the sorts of cooperation that we can see and we have experienced. In 1993, STANNAVFORLANT was transferred to the command of SACEUR in Mons and sent into the Mediterranean, specifically to the Adriatic, to take part in an international embargo operations enforcing the United Nations embargoes against the states of the former Yugoslavia, both the trade and the arms embargoes. During the course of that particular operation, and in the last year in particular, STANNAVFORLANT carried out a number of boardings and challenges. We challenged 5,800 ships this year alone, and we left in May, and carried out 617 boardings to check on papers and cargoes. Some of those were cooperative, some of them were uncooperative. The tight control over shipping passing through the Otranto Straits, which is the straits between the heel of Italy and the Albanian coast, we believe was watertight in terms of contraband. And of course, I can't state with any certainty about where contraband may have got in from other areas, but from this maritime perspective, we believe that we contributed significantly to the process of achieving some form of solution to the Yugoslav situation. And we're very proud of what we did in Bosnia, albeit for 3 years. Ladies and gentlemen, one doesn't know what's going to happen in Yugoslavia. You know that probably as well as I do. But we are ready to return, if required. We are at 15 days' notice to go back to the Adriatic, should sanctions be required to be reimposed. We hope that they're not. We will have to wait and see. In the meantime, as I said, in May, we were released from those operations and allowed to return to our home waters of the Atlantic. And we went initially to the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean areas, we achieved a number of firsts. The first of those was to take part in the counter-narcotics operations that are run constantly in the Caribbean. This was a first for Standing Naval Force Atlantic. We've never before taken part. We have a capability, a fairly sophisticated capability of surveillance of air and sea space, and we were able to contribute to the international effort that takes place, coordinated from Key West. We contributed with our surveillance effort into the interagency effort. And although I don't have detailed feedback of how successful or otherwise we were, I have been assured by the Key West authorities that we achieved a significant deterrence capability, although we had no powers of arrest. Neither did we have law enforcement agencies on board. In addition, we took part in another first, which was for Standing Naval Force to take part in Exercise UNITAS, which is the annual exercise with the South American navies run by US Southern Command, I beg your pardon, South Atlantic Command, out of Puerto Rico. It's been running for 37 years. It's a US bilateral arrangement with South American navies, and we were allowed to join for the first time. We found that very useful, very instructive, and proved once again that we can operate with other navies other than the NATO navies. We've now left the Caribbean, obviously, and we're at Norfolk for a period of maintenance for the ships, and we sail from here next Monday and begin our return to European waters. En route, we will be taking part in a major NATO exercise called Bright Horizon, which is designed to test NATO's crisis response and management procedures. We will be taking part in that exercise during the middle of September. You'll recall from the NATO summit in 1991, President Clinton's visit to Brussels, the NATO headquarters. I had the privilege of being there for that summit, and one of the initiatives President Clinton launched was the Partnership for Peace. We will be taking part in the most ambitious maritime Partnership for Peace exercise at the end of September in the Baltic Sea, when we arrive at the Polish port of Gdynia, where I will be the exercise director for up to 19 ships composed of 11 NATO nations and 6 non-NATO nations, notably Poland, Sweden, Lithuania, etc. And we will be practicing procedures to enable us to be interoperable in the service of the United Nations for such things as embargo operations, search and rescue, and humanitarian assistance. And this exercise starts in Gdynia and finishes in Oslo and lasts for a period of 10 days. So, ladies and gentlemen, from active service off Yugoslavia through to the anti-narcotics operations in the Caribbean, to a major NATO exercise in the North Atlantic, and to a major and the largest maritime PFP exercise to date in the Baltic Sea, all of this in the space of 1 year. These events perhaps demonstrate the flexibility of maritime assets and in particular the health of NATO's maritime capability, which is still very strong. And I believe, very sincerely, that it does demonstrate the health of the transatlantic link. We also believe one little thing that our force enables us to show is that, in particular in STANNAVFORLANT, we work best when we work together. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have to say at this stage. I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Gentleman, front row.
Yes, thank you. 2 questions. Why was this force pulled out of the Adriatic? I mean, is there nothing no contraband,
Yep.
no smuggling to protect against? And 2, going to your Caribbean operations, you said that you had no powers to enforce the law. You had no law enforcement on board. What did you do with this capability to monitor air and sea traffic? And secondly, did you work around Cuba? Did you patrol around Cuba? And did you personally do you believe that there's any cocaine coming through Cuba?
Right. 3 questions. First question. The Adriatic. Why were we taken out of the Adriatic? We were taken out of the Adriatic because the United Nations embargoes were lifted, and therefore there was no enforcement required, and therefore we were allowed to return to our normal area of operations. Our sister force, the Standing Naval Force Mediterranean, operates normally in the Mediterranean. They are still there, not in the Adriatic specifically, because there's no enforcement required, and they are at 5 days' notice to return if the United Nations wishes to reimpose the sanctions. So there are no sanctions at the moment, so there's therefore no requirement. The second question, what did we do if we couldn't enforce law enforcement aspects? First of all, we operated on the high seas, international waters, and therefore, in order for us to have any form of law enforcement capability, we would have to revert from the NATO flag to the national flag. We would have to then become an element of a Coast Guard. A US Navy warship takes down its US naval ensign and hoists the Coast Guard ensign on these operations and becomes part of the US Coast Guard temporarily in order to be able to enforce those operations. We are an international force. We don't have that capability, and it would be a significant legal step for us to take it. So our job was to contribute to surveillance. We flew helicopters to look for small boats. We operated a very secure radar look, both of the air and the sea space, wherever we were operating. We did not operate anywhere near Cuba. I have no knowledge of the situation in terms of narcotic smuggling in relation to Cuba.
Is it busy out there? Sorry.
There's a lot going on, yes. There's a lot of innocent traffic, and as I understand from the Key West authorities, that there is a lot of illicit traffic. We reported what we saw to JITAF East in Key West, and they interpreted what we saw.
This is more or less an experiment, the counter-narcotics thing, an experiment for you to go into that more frequently in the future?
Well, I think this year's activity could be characterized as an experiment. It was the first time we'd ever done it, to see how successful or unsuccessful we were, to see how the nations themselves who control our movements would respond to the request and approval. Whether we're allowed to do it next year when the force returns to the Caribbean is a question for the nations to address, but I expect that will be the case because everybody's concerned about the counter-narcotics trade.
Do you anticipate future roles like that?
I would expect so, yes. Yeah.
How does a NATO force function in both the Caribbean or in UNITAS, which is down off South America, when it's out of the NATO zone of operation?
Yes, it's out of the geographical area of the NATO treaty, but it doesn't remove me from the chain of command. So I still answered to General Sheehan. He still was responsible for me, and I was responsible to him. I operated with Admiral Ferguson, who's US Commsololant, not in a command relationship, but on a cooperation basis, working with the South American navies on a regular basis in the Puerto Rico exercise areas, where we had been operating for the last 2 months, particularly during the Hurricane Bertha scenario.
This is an out-of-area op for
Yes.
a NATO force.
Yes, it's not unusual for us to go out of area. We've been doing it since 1967. Now, I might amplify that. The Puerto Rico operating areas to the south of Puerto Rico are outside the geographical area of NATO. The force first went there in 1969 and has been there 19 times since 1969. It is not an unusual event. UNITAS was unusual.
It's a little less of a stretch to operate south of Portugal than to operate.
The reason we go to Puerto Rico is the tremendous facilities available from the Atlantic Fleet Weapons Training Facility down there, which I'm sure you're familiar with. We were allowed to use those facilities in order to bring back our warfighting capability that had atrophied somewhat in embargo operations. And it was terrific facilities. We went there for training. So.
Commodore, you mentioned interoperability and,
Yeah.
and you'd work on a lot of interoperability issues.
Yeah.
With the ongoing changes and increased emphasis on data processing, advanced communications, are you finding that these changes are making it easier to become more interoperable, or is it creating more problems?
With all new equipment within NATO now, we have standing agreements that enable the nations to agree on commonality of equipment. So if, for example, take data links as a good example, computer-to-computer data transfer electronically from ship to ship, those new pieces of equipment are designed and built to be interoperable. So we use a link system, which is known as Link 11, and we're designing a Link 16 to replace it. The agreements that the nations reach on the configuration of that equipment is agreed. They're all agreed in Brussels, and the equipments may be built nationally, but to a common standard and a common interoperable capability, so that when we turn on the new gear in the American ship, and the Canadian ship, and the British ship, and the Dutch ship, they all work together, although they may be made by a Canadian or a Dutch company.
Follow-up, does that also apply to the operational concepts, command and control, combat control?
Yes,
within the ship?
within the NATO system, yes. Not within the design of the ship, because that's a national prerogative. For example, the internal design of the operations, the Combat Information Center in my flagship, which is British, is of a different sort of emphasis and different design to that of the American ship, clearly, because we're different navies. But they work together. That's the key point. So.
say that the NATO's efforts to make sure that new systems are interoperable has been successful so far?
Very successful. It's not cracked the problem by any means, because every nation has its own arms and electronics industry which it seeks to enhance and protect. Of course, that's natural. But it is one of the great strengths of NATO, but it's taken a long, hard struggle over 45 years to get there. But if you compare it with other nations and navies who are trying to operate in any form of alliance, then, I mean, the Warsaw Pact had significant interoperability problems. They solved that by making everybody buy Russian. It's not quite the same in the West. So we have to make and build our equipment to make sure that they operate together. And very largely it's successful. We still have problems. I won't beat about the bush. We still have a gun system in the British ship which is completely different from the rest of the ships in the force, who will operate an Italian gun system, including the American. It is different, it is difficult, but by and large, we make it work, and it works well.
Doesn't that give some reason to pause for concern on the concept of NATO enlargement? Because the forces that we're talking about adding on have all been, East Bloc, and there's no standardization.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I've just come from 3 years at NATO headquarters in Brussels, where the whole question of enlargement is under active debate, as you know, and it's essentially a political question. The military implications of enlargement are quite significant, and they're being discussed and made aware to the political leaders. And nobody should be under any doubt that it is a cheap process. It isn't. We understand that, and it's up to us to ensure that our partners, by the Partnership for Peace process, also understand that the NATO insurance policy doesn't come cost-free.
Thank you.
You're most welcome.